and they go into this tavern on a place called Baker's Bottom, and they engage in kind of active diplomacy. They think that this is a way to keep the peace. What they don't know is there are probably somewhere about a dozen men lurking in a second room, a back apartment in that tavern, who have gathered there to kill them.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is February 1st, 1775, the Pennsylvania Journal. This begins a story that starts in the 18th century, right prior to the American Revolution, and continues here in the 21st century in analyzing at the forks of the Ohio what was the relationship between the colonials, all Englishmen in general, and the Native Americans, the indigenous people, especially the tribes that are famous, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Mingo, the Wyandot. On this time, 1775, we associate with the American Revolution. Well, simultaneously, there was a contest between the Native Americans on their land and the colonials of Virginia and Pennsylvania on their land. I welcome Professor Robert G. Parkinson. His new book is Heart of American Darkness, Bewilderment and Murder on the Early Frontier. Rob, the Pennsylvania Journal in February of 1775 prints what is famous as Logan's Lament. This is a document written up by a man named John Gibson, sitting with a Native American, a Mingo chief named, we call him Logan. He had an Indian name that is important, Shikellamy. And Logan was reflecting upon what had happened to him and his family the year before. I read in part, Logan is the friend of white men. I had even thought to live with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Cresap. Colonel Cresap, he writes, in cold blood and unprovoked, cut off all the relations of Logan, not sparing even my wife, my women and children. That is part of the lament that is printed in the journal, in Pennsylvania Journal, and has become extremely famous through the last 2 centuries. Certainly was part of the learning of school children in the 19th century. At that point, what do we need to know about the document when he says Colonel Cresap? You have identified that as an error. Who is Colonel Cresap, and who was Logan at that moment that he had vengeance on Colonel Cresap? Good evening to you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you, John. Well, Colonel Cresap isn't the guy who killed his family. In fact, anybody who killed his family didn't have the last name of Cresap. What Logan is referring to is a premeditated, cold-blooded murder of 8 Mingo men, women, and children that happened on April 30th the year before in 1774. And the Cresap family was one of the leading colonial land speculators, traders, and scouts in this region. And Logan believes, his real name, he has several names, but James Logan Shikellamy, or Soyoktawa, believes that the Cresap family is to be responsible, and he misidentifies so that's one misidentification. The second one is that he says that it's Colonel Cresap, which is really a reference to Thomas Cresap, the father, not Michael Cresap, the son, who was in the area and was possibly could have done these things.
This takes place on a river under a elm tree, Logan's elm, famous at the time, afterwards, and in the 19th century. All these events we now see Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio. But at this time, it's best to think of them as rivers because there were no sovereign borders that people paid attention to. There were no towns. So let's explore the Cresap family. And Thomas Cresap is the patriarch. He lives a very long time. He was born in England, in Yorkshire, and he came to America and understood that the boundaries of Pennsylvania and Maryland were not finalized. There was back and forth all the time. Sometimes Lancaster was in Pennsylvania, sometimes it was in Maryland. Was that typical of these times, that men tried to take advantage of a moving border and the governors?
Most certainly. And the real problem is that the maps are wrong. And it's not just Lancaster that might be in Pennsylvania, but the charter that is given to William Penn says that the 30th parallel is the boundary for Pennsylvania, the southern boundary for Pennsylvania. If that's the case, the 30th parallel cuts. I'm sorry, this is for Maryland. Maryland's boundary is the 30th parallel. And if that's the case, then Philadelphia is in Maryland, not just Lancaster, but Philadelphia is in Maryland. So there's the imprecision of all these maps. And there are northern and southern problems about where one colony begins and one colony ends, and then of course there's a huge eastern and western problem about where does colonial settlement stretch to as we go deeper into the continent. And so both Maryland and Pennsylvania claim what is today Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, as theirs. And so there starts in the 1730s. There starts a simmering civil war between settlers in Maryland and settlers from Pennsylvania. And Thomas Cresap's house, he's about early 30s at this point. His house becomes the epicenter of this civil war.
It's part of the wonderful confusion of these moments that there were times on the page I couldn't tell whether this was a war between Pennsylvania and Maryland, or between the people who lived in Maryland, sometimes in Pennsylvania, and indigenous people who resented the advances of the colonials. And the truth of it is, that isn't complicated enough, because we're about to head into a revolutionary period where sometimes the British were sympathetic to the Native Americans and used them, and sometimes the colonials were sympathetic and used them, and then oftentimes they fought them. And Rob sorted all that out in the person of these two families, the Cresaps and the Shikalames. The patriarch Shikalame, also to match Thomas Cresap, was a man who did William Penn a favor. How so, Rob?
So the Iroquois are very worried about the Iroquois, whose home base is today in upstate New York, and are a very powerful confederation of, at the beginning of the 18th century, 5 nations, and then by the 1730s, it becomes known as the 6 nations. And they're very concerned about, as Pennsylvania expands, there's more and more pressure on groups like the Shawnee and Delaware, who live today in northern New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania, especially. They are starting to migrate back to the Ohio country. The Shawnee come from there originally in the 17th century, and they're starting to head back to where they came from about 3 generations before. And the Iroquois are very concerned about keeping their own political prominence in the eastern backcountry by dominating these groups and saying they have the political power over them. And so as they begin to sort of migrate and try to slip out of the grasp of the Iroquois, they send a man named Shikellamy, who's an Oneida, to what is today Sunbury, Pennsylvania, to monitor this migration and hopefully stop it. And so he becomes pals with William Penn's secretary, a man named James Logan. And together, Shikellamy and Logan put together some land deals that are bad for the Shawnees and the Delawares, but good for the Iroquois. And the most famous of those is the walking purchase, the very, very famous or infamous walking purchase of 1737. That is the walking purchase, which is basically a wholesale conquest of the Eastern Delaware native peoples, is orchestrated by the team of Shikellamy and Logan. And that's where the Logan name comes from. This man, James Logan, who is William Penn's sort of chief factotum, is so important to the Shikellamy family that he gives his 2 oldest sons an honorary names of Logan. That's where the name Logan of Logan's Lament comes from. It's reflective of this political partnership with James Logan.
Oh, let's be clear now. We have two families. We're going to call one the Cresaps. That's their proper name. We're going to call the other one the Shikellamy. But there are several Shikellamys and there are several Logans. So we have to sort them out, as there are several Thomases and Michaels in the Cresaps. They use family names again. We're going to go into what is important here, which is Michael Cresap, Thomas Cresap's son, Colonel Thomas Cresap, his son Michael. And we're not going to go to Shikellamy, the Oneida diplomat. We're going to go to his second son, who is called James Logan Shikellamy.
Right.
We come back. The book is Heart of American Darkness. Robert G. Parkinson is the author. Bewilderment and Horror of the Early Frontier. I am very well read in revolutionary material. I have never seen all of this put together. Suddenly, it becomes important to identify how it is the Native Americans were treated by the colonials and vice versa, because they lived next door to each other. They took advantages of the same rivers. They hunted the same ground. They intermarried. All of this was happening while the colonials, the story we know very well, especially out of Boston, revolted from the English crown because of indifference. However, we now go to an additional irony that Rob finds, and I'm sympathetic to, the story by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, about the conduct of a man named Kurtz coming up against natives, indigenous people in Central Africa. Rob, can you explain quickly how these two stories intertwined for you?
Absolutely. I mean, this bewilderment being the first word of the subtitle is the theme of the book, for the author as well as the reader, I think, of trying to sort out what all happens here. And the title and the theme of thinking about Joseph Conrad's brilliant and yet problematic novella, Heart of Darkness, that was published in 1902. I would teach world history, John, in my first job, 2 sections of modern world history, and I would often teach this text and leave the classroom thinking, boy, this feels like a familiar story to me. This doesn't seem like, and when you take, for the readers of Heart of Darkness, you might have noticed that at the very, very beginning, at the very top of the story, the very first words spoken aloud by the narrator, Charles Marlowe, is, and this also was one of the dark places of the earth. And he's not talking about the Congo River in the 1880s and 90s. He's not talking about the scramble for Africa. He's talking about the Thames River and what that must have been like for Roman soldiers, the ends of the earth. So thinking about the Thames, which he then goes on to describe as which also now floats the dreams of men, the seeds of commonwealths and the germs of empire. Now in the end of the 19th century for Britain was also a dark place on the earth, and I always thought that kind of transferability tell us something, or not tell us something, show us a new way to think about the American backcountry in the 18th century.
The American backcountry now has to deal with these two families, and we've described them generally, but it's important to come to Michael Cresap. The year 1754 is important for George Washington because he doesn't die. He takes on the French, who are fighting the British Empire on the continent of North America, and the French have allies among the Native Americans. So do the British. This is supposed to be confusing because everybody in the frontier was confused by it. George Washington had built something called Fort Necessity. He's quickly overwhelmed, and in retreat of the events of that time lead him, one of the people in his party, to murder a Frenchman. That may be the beginning of a global war. I mention that only because at that point, Washington flees after these episodes and passes through Old Town, what is now Old Town, Maryland, which is the home of the Cresaps. And Rob, you in the book present the fact that the Cresaps would have been very well known to Washington and Washington to them. What was he at that moment to them? How did they regard his failed mission in 54?
They're very important to one another because they're all co-partners in the Ohio Company, and the Ohio Company is the sort of center of gravity for the Ohio Company is the Lee family and the Washington family, and so the Ohio Company has requested 500,000 acres in what today is the Forks of the Ohio as a private venture for them, a land speculation effort. And the Crown has agreed in 1749, agrees to allow the Ohio Company 200,000 of the 500 that they've asked for right now. And then a further 300,000 if they settle a number of families in the vicinity of the Forks of the Ohio or the Pittsburgh region. And so the only people who are not either married to or relation to a Washington or a Lee family are the Cresaps. Thomas Cresap is an original partner of the Ohio Company, and his oldest son Daniel, the older brother to Michael, are Ohio Company partners. And so when Washington goes to Old Town, and he goes there several times over the course of his life, and sometimes he brings people with him who are other members of the Ohio Company. It's almost like a rump meeting of this group, and they're the spear point for for English colonialism to the Forks, which scares the French so much, which brings on this conflict. So Washington's being there is a result of this venture that he thinks is going to make him a very, very rich man.
There's no other way to say it that Washington's part of the land speculators that the Cresaps represent. Everybody's involved in that. The English crown is trying to stop it, drawing lines in the Appalachians. Can't go beyond this. The French are very keen on keeping the British out. And the following year, General Braddock leads an expedition to what is now Pittsburgh and is soundly defeated and loses his life. Again, Washington and the men flee back through Old Town. We're going to turn now. You see all these contests going on, and we haven't even got to the murder by Yellow Creek. The book is Heart of American Darkness. Robert Parkinson. Rob Parkinson is the author. There is no easy sorting this out. This isn't good guys, bad guys. This is everybody moving around in what one side regards as a wilderness. The other side regards as very well settled and extremely tribal. So that we have the Shawnees and the Delawares and the Mingos living side by side, and there are Wyandots, there are other tribes. They all know their tribes. We have the colonials, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia living side by side and at odds. And then we have land speculators who look to take advantage of land that belonged in the hunting grounds of the Native Americans or in Pennsylvania, or if you're a Pennsylvanian, in Virginia. You can understand everybody's armed. And then there are rumors of the Native Americans being savages. This word savage is routine, I learned from Rob. So we come now to the events that we started with. The Logan's Lament, losing his family by the Yellow Creek. Please carefully, Rob, introduce us to that murder. Why did it take place? What is the reasoning? It wasn't Colonel Tom Cresap. It was Michael Cresap. Who was Michael at the time? I believe he was 32 years old. And why did it come to murder?
Well, the operative word in what you just said is the word tribal. And we have long thought of native peoples as tribal, but one of the things I like to do in this book is to consider Pennsylvanians and Virginians and Marylanders as acting just as tribal. They are tribes themselves. And so what has gone on? The British are broke. And we know this in reference to the imperial crisis, obviously, and this is the reason we have taxes and tea being thrown overboard in Boston. But one of the ways that Britain tries to cut costs and save money is they take all their troops out of Fort Pitt. And so Fort Pitt, which was during the 7 Years' War, was this sort of bastion of English power in over the mountains now lays empty, and so a power vacuum about who actually controls the forks of the Ohio, going back to the time when George Washington said it's for the Ohio Company and therefore for Virginia. Virginia and Pennsylvania have battled mostly over paper and maps over who's going to control the forks. But after the British leave, it turns into yet another border civil war, just like the one from the 1730s between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Pennsylvania and Virginia they both say this is, they extend county borders to encompass the forks. It's Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. It's also West Augusta County, Virginia. Both sides elect a slate of magistrates. They lock one another up. They beat one another up. There's some shooting going on and anybody who lives out there has to basically decide which tribe they belong to. That devolves into problems with Native peoples who are very concerned about what is going on here. Who's in charge? Is this who do we deal with? Who's going to restrain any kind of colonial scouting and trading? What is the regulatory body that's going on here? And so that devolves into there's a small incident on the Ohio River of basically a couple of traders get jumped by a native group of Cherokees, actually, who really aren't involved at all. And that just sort of escalates fear more and more over the course of really March and April 1774, right? Just as the Parliament has voted for the coercive acts and the ship carrying that news is on the Atlantic, this is when this is all devolving. There is a tavern today where the Mountaineer Casino and Racetrack is in West Virginia. That's right on the Ohio River, and right across the river is the mouth of Yellow Creek, which dumps into the Ohio. A couple of tenths of a mile up Yellow Creek is a band of Mingo natives. And Logan, James Logan Shekellemy, and his family, his mother is there with him, his sister is there with him, his brother is there with him, and there are other Mingos who are there.
This is the Logan of Logan's Lament, the second son of the original Shekellemy. Please continue.
That's right. Now, and the Shekellemies have grown up for 40 years. Their father was a negotiator. The family has tried their best to get along with colonists for their whole lives, and so this is just for them another episode of diplomacy, what they think is diplomacy. So they paddle down Yellow Creek and cross the Ohio River, and what they think is going to be an effort to try to keep the peace in. And they go into this tavern on a place called Baker's Bottom. And they engage in kind of active diplomacy. They think that this is a way to keep the peace. What they don't know is there are probably somewhere about a dozen men lurking in a second room, a back apartment in that tavern, who have gathered there to kill them. And so there is a shooting contest is proposed. Hey, you guys hit a mark out there in the trees. Let's see who can get closest to it. But that is really an effort to unload the Mingo's rifles. And then as soon as the shots are fired, there's a scuffle inside, and those men hiding in the back apartment leap out and kill Logan's younger brother. They kill his sister. They shoot down his mother and three other Mingo men whose names we don't know. And so eight Native people die at this episode.
Let me read the names of the shooters.
Okay.
Nathan Tomlinson, Daniel Greathouse, Edward King, Michael Myers, Jacob Greathouse, Joseph Swearingen, and Raymond Joseph Tomlinson. Not one of them is named Cresap. Where is Michael Cresap? Michael
Cresap. So as tensions are rising, Michael finds himself about 10 days before this in charge of a group of angry settlers who are threatening to do something like this. And Michael tries sometimes he encourages them. At some point during those rough week before Yellow Creek, he attacks natives in a canoe coming down the Ohio River, but he also tries to talk them out of it, and so doing further damage. So he's sort of, what the record shows is Michael's kind of all over the place about how much violence he wants to inflict this week before Yellow Creek. And a couple of days before, he says, "I'm done. I'm out of here. I can't handle this anymore." And he takes himself to a place called Catfish Camp, which is today Washington, Pennsylvania, which is about 30 miles away from the Ohio River. That's where he is when this massacre happens. Logan is also not there. The Logan of Logan's Lament is also out hunting when his mother, brother, and sister are murdered as well. So neither of the people that we associate with this are anywhere near the area.
Important to establish the Cresaps are a violent family, and Thomas Cresap, the patriarch, has often traded shots with authorities when he was living in Maryland, and there was a contest between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Michael Cresap has grown up in a family where they are the law wherever they are. And they often build on lands that used to be Native American lands. They're not quite invaders, they're land speculators. They take advantage of where there is no law or where there is tension between Pennsylvania and Virginia. The Shikelemis, on the other hand, as the professor has introduced, are the closest thing I can word is the word diplomat. Does that work, Rob?
Yep. And ambassador, diplomat. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And Logan, the second son, is the most diplomatic of all.
Yep.
And his family is no threat to anyone. So what happens, and Rob, you identified as the horror, which is the word from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Mm-hmm. The men who did the killing. Why, Rob? Can you piece it together? Why would they open fire on defenseless women? And there was a baby in the arms of one of them.
That's right. The baby is the baby of John Gibson, who you identified at the top as the translator of Logan's Lament. He is Kune, which is the name of Logan's sister, runs out of the tavern and makes it down to the shoreline of the Ohio River, clutching this infant in her arms, and she turns around and begs for the child's life. Please don't shoot this baby. And she said, what the record says is he is the son of a white man, John Gibson, and they allow her to hand the baby over, and then they shoot her in the forehead.
Right, and this massacre right now, mm-hmm. We identify the moment when Logan himself is not present, but he will learn about it.
Yep.
And that leads to eventually the lament. But I want to characterize all of these Indian, Native American confrontations. There was something of the violence everywhere, Rob, in reading the story. At any moment, I think you had one scene where 3 Native Americans came forward across a field. They put their rifles down outside and went inside and started being convivial with the family. But at one point, one of them reached over to a young woman's hair, a daughter's hair, and stroked it and said something in his tongue like, "That would make a nice scalp." So there's tension always. Is that the way to think of this, Rob?
Yes. Well, that's what the young man thinks is what is being said. We don't know that that's exactly what he said, but the fear is ever present, that they are terrified. And that scene comes at the very end of Pontiac's War, which is yet another episode of conflict after the 7 Years' War and before Yellow Creek. And in that, there is a significant fight in Old Town in which Michael Cresap kills a native person who's attacking his home at the very end of the lane of his house, and scalps him and takes his moccasins. So Michael does this at 21 years old, and his older brother, Thomas Cresap Jr., was killed during the 7 Years' War in the hills not very far away. So these are families that are extraordinarily familiar with trauma and horror and violence.
We're now going to turn to a transformation that is a complete surprise. Michael Cresap who has been the boaster and threatener, but at the same time, not present at the scene of the murders that he encouraged with his loud talk, boasting. We're going to turn him into a patriot. The book is Heart of American Darkness. Robert Parkinson is the author. Bewilderment and Horror on the Early Frontier. This is so much more complicated than the colonials versus the Royal Navy. It's even more complicated than I know, but I'm doing the best I can, given that we have Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia in one contest, the Mingos, the Shawnees, the Delawares in another contest, and the British and the American colonials in another contest. And then we have the colonials who are not quite sure which side they're on. Nobody is. Rob makes the point again and again. What happened when they heard about the Continental Congress in 74 and the one in 75?
Right?
And
They don't.
Bunkers Hill, everybody said, what's in it for me? Did I get that right, Rob? What's in it for me?
You got that right. It's another layer of bewilderment that now extends over the older colonial fights about these things. And so everyone has to all of a sudden choose again which tribe they want to support.
And we come now to what is known as Bunkers Hill, which is in fact Breed's Hill. I hope you all know that I'm not going to have time to tell that story, but in any event, the word goes out from Congress, which is now in Philadelphia, moving south away from the British, that they need volunteers, especially from Pennsylvania. I'm not sure whether these are Virginians or Pennsylvanians, but they pass as riflemen. What kind of volunteers, and what happens with Michael Cresap, Rob?
Right. So the important thing to know is Logan is not the only one that blames Michael Cresap for what happens, the Yellow Creek and then the subsequent war between Virginia and the Shawnee that develops over the course of late summer and fall. After that, there are a number of people who send messages to newspapers in Philadelphia and New York especially, who are saying that Michael Cresap is the reason for all this. And there are a number of British officials who think that he is the reason that all this nonsense has happened, this really sort of horrific violence that begins. I shouldn't call it nonsense, and that happens out in Ohio River. So
because Logan takes revenge through 74.
That's right. Logan takes revenge on several families. Logan, the erstwhile diplomat before, has now broken. He's had enough of this, and he turns into an avenger, and he kills almost 20 people, takes a number of captives in revenge for these things. So
and the revenge is very challenging because children are slaughtered. The Spicer family children, the Roberts family children, they're deliberately murdered, provocatively so, because Logan wants the Cresaps and the colonials to know that this is Logan revenging his children.
Right. And so the number of people blame Michael specifically and wrongly at the time, not just Logan. So when the Continental Congress calls for volunteers, and what this call is really the creation of a Continental Army, because it's the first request for volunteers for anyone outside of New England. So they ask for the creation of a number of rifle companies in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania to be created for those troops to get as quickly as they possibly can to Boston. And one of the two Maryland companies is going to be led by Michael and two of his nephews, and strangely, one of the men in a sergeant in that unit is Daniel Greathouse, who John read as one of the actual perpetrators of what happens at Yellow Creek. And so
that is one contest. We have several going on here because Virginia is now in revolution, but people are deciding whether they're pro-crown, pro-colonial. Who are the colonials? And we need to enter into the Virginia governor. His name is Dunmore, Lord Dunmore, who launches a campaign against the Native Americans, especially Logan. And those are the episodes that come to Logan making his lament. Who is Dunmore? What does he want to achieve?
Dunmore wants glory for himself and for his colony, a colony that he doesn't really want to govern when he's assigned there. He's the governor of New York when the Virginia governor dies, and he has to go to Williamsburg, and he spends about 10 months dragging his feet and roundly complaining and drinking a lot, and before he finally accepts his fate and goes to Williamsburg. And he very soon, once he gets to Virginia, realizes that there is all this opportunity for him to gain lands out in this unpredictable place, and so he is looking for ways to exploit this bewildering situation, and so he especially pushes forward Virginia's claim, and then once this fight happens in Virginia and Pennsylvania, he then really pushes for this to turn into a sort of a military expedition against the Shawnee, but really to control the forks of the Ohio for him and Virginia.
And there's a lot of killing going on. This is Lord Dunmore's war.
Yeah.
And there are invaders, and the Native Americans are the victims of the killing.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, the Native Americans sue for peace, and that is when Logan comes forward with the lament to his relative who lost his wife. Logan's sister was John Gibson's wife.
Yep.
And that's where the lament comes from. And that's why Logan thinks it was Colonel Cresap, not Michael Cresap, who launched the murder raid on Yellow Creek.
Right.
Now, all this is important. As complicated as it is, it's important because this is going to become a legend well into the 19th and 20th century, and here in the 21st century. One more detail, Rob, before we go to Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Logan wants peace with the lament. Is that the way to understand that? He was ending his war personally at that point.
Yes. Logan is announcing that he has done terrible things, but he is satisfied. And part of that is also, again, this there is the diplomat coming back out yet again. This was not a war. I mean, he doesn't see this as a war with Virginia. This is him taking personal revenge for this terrible thing that has befallen his family, and therefore this is over, and we can return to the great beams of peace.
We're headed to Boston. Heart of American Darkness. Robert Parkinson is the author. This is the American Revolution as you've never seen it. I've read a lot of books about the American Revolution, especially the events of 1774, 1775, 1776. Never seen this complicated a story. Native Americans who were pushed back by the colonials for 100 years, taking their families to the Ohio River Valley, the Shawnee, the Mingos, and the Delawares in particular. The Iroquois of New York now have sold the land of the Delaware. The Mingos are Iroquois who've moved to the Ohio. And the Wyandots and the Shawnee, they've sold land that they didn't own, but the colonials didn't know that. They just bought it. Land speculation is very commonplace across the frontier. The whole idea of frontier is now being invented. There are two families that are important here. The Cresap family. Michael Cresap is now the man we're focusing on because James Logan Shikellamy, the head of an Indian family, blames Michael Cresap for the murder of his relatives. And he issues in 1774 what is known as Logan's Lament, saying, "My war is over. I'm back to peace. My vengeance is satisfied. I have glutted my vengeance by murdering two families I know, probably more families, including the children." Mm-hmm. And all of that is background for what we're now about to do, which is regain the revolution, led by Michael Cresap, the captain of a regiment or a battalion of riflemen. As they arrive in Massachusetts, George Washington is in charge of the the revolutionaries at the time camped outside of Boston. Rob, Washington doesn't welcome them. Why not?
Well, they get a ton of press before they get there. These are the first men to to join actually make the army continental in any sort of way. It's a New England army until these cats arrive, and they get a tremendous amount of press, and the press is overflowing and gushing and into the romantic kind of way of thinking, seeing these riflemen as America's secret weapons, that the British don't stand a chance against us if we have men like these. And they go on and on and on about
They've been putting on shooting contests. Explain, Rob.
shooting contests, the William Tell style kinds of things. They take their shirts off. They dance around in a quote unquote Indian style. They lavish a lot of words about the scars on their body, the fact that they don't need to eat, they don't need to sleep in a bed, they can just live out. They're such natural men that there's no possible way that professional British redcoats stand a chance in this revolution. This thing's going to be over in a matter of hours as soon as these guys arrive. And when they do arrive, they turn out to be really problematic. They don't want to follow any kind of army discipline. A number of them desert over to the British, which no one would have seen coming because they see them as these kind of political superheroes. And Washington says to one of his staff officers, "I wish they had never come." They are really, really problematic.
And Washington, this is the same Washington who's the land speculator 10 years before when he was with the Virginia militia. Now he's commanding the Continental Army, such as it is.
Yes.
And Michael Cresap leads this group on what is called the Beeline March from the backwoods. Well, they're actually the front woods of the Ohio River Valley all the way to Boston. But Michael is ill. What's happened?
Well, I think he got bit by a mosquito that had malaria in Kentucky. He was out scouting in the months before Lexington and Concord, and when he gets the news, his old man Thomas Cresap is one of the men who's charged with organizing this company, and he puts Michael and a number of his grandsons in charge of this company. And when Michael gets the news, he's pretty bummed. He's pretty crestfallen when he hears this, because he said, "My affairs are in a pretty bad state right now, and I'm not feeling all that great." And that probably is the beginning of malaria, which, frankly, John, a walk from Frederick, Maryland to Boston with malaria is a kind of heroic act. I mean, I don't think I could do a 400-mile walk or whatever it is with malaria, but Michael does it. He gets there. He has one sort of very thunderstormy night of exchange of gunfire with the British out sort of just behind Bunker's Hill, and then he collapses into a bed at the Peacock Tavern, and he's on the verge of death. A few weeks later, he transfers to New York City, and by October, actually a year to the day that Logan gives the lament, Michael Cresap dies. Now,
a detail. Michael Cresap is identified as the man who caused all this tragedy on the frontier. Michael Cresap, up to the point of his dying, has been understood as a villain. But here's the magic that Rob's going to explain. The patriot cause needs heroes. And Michael Cresap is about to be transformed into a hero. I'm not quite sure how it works, Rob. Explain how they did this. This was magic.
Right. Oh, I definitely think this was magic. So, while Michael's walking, right, or when he gets the news, they're organizing, they're getting their gear together in Maryland, and they begin to walk. During those months, in the few weeks after Lexington and Concord, even before Bunker Hill, everyone's wondering, how are all these British officials going to react to the news of war? So everybody's keeping their eye on all these royal governors. They're keeping their eye on any kind of army or navy captains that are around. They're keeping their eye on what the two positions, especially. One is called the Northern Indian Superintendent, and his name is, at this point, is Guy Johnson, and the Southern one, his name is John Stewart. How are those two guys going to talk to native peoples about this new imperial war that's now starting? And so there's a lot of worry and rumor and newspaper stories that these guys are quote unquote exciting natives to fall upon the frontiers. They're also saying that they think that some of these governors, especially in the South, are quote unquote exciting or tampering with enslaved peoples to rise up and kill their masters. There's a lot of insecurity and worry and anxiety. We might even call it bewilderment going on in the spring and summer of 1775 while Michael's walking to Boston. So all of a sudden, it seems like not only might the British be our enemy, but the British might have these alliances with native peoples. And we're going to need supermen to kill not just one, but probably both. And who better than this guy who knows how to kill Indians, as we know. We might have not liked that before, but we're going to need that kind of thing now. And he's obviously thrilled to walk to Boston to kill British people. These are the kind of people we're going to need. These are the true Americans as that begins to emerge in these weeks and hours of the beginnings of American identity making, which will turn into American nation making and patriotism making, which is happening at the moment while Michael's on the road walking to Boston.
So the newspapers take it up as a cause.
Yep.
Michael Cresap, patriot hero. Some of these newspapers have noted Logan's Lament.
Yep.
February of 75, but they're willing to take up the cause of the patriot, and there's nobody there to come forward and say, hey, is he a bad guy or a good guy? There's nobody to do that. They overwhelm everybody with Michael Cresap being a good guy. Let's get to New York because he's trying to go home. He's 33 years old.
33.
He has four or five children now. He left his wife Mary when he marched to Boston. He reaches a boarding house in New York and dies October 18th, 1775. I think that's the right date. Mm-hmm. But New York can't let him die in peace. What happens, Rob?
Well, he's never been to New York before. So here's this stranger who dies in town, but he's a very, very famous stranger. And New York is probably of the metropolitan areas in colonial America, such as they are, it's the least patriot. There's the loyalism rears its head in New York City and Manhattan much more than, say, in Philadelphia.
Well, the British are headed in New York pretty soon, so they're going to make it.
That's one of the reasons why they're going there. Good harbor, but also some friends there, right? And so New York patriots are a bit on the back foot kind of all the time. So when this famous stranger dies in a boarding house, it doesn't matter that he's a stranger. He's famous. And so they throw him the most lavish funeral that I can find. It's the same week that Michael dies, the president of the Continental Congress, Peyton Randolph, dies of an apoplectic stroke in Philadelphia. And they give him basically the exact same funeral for the president of the Continental Congress and Michael Cresap. And I think if George Washington would have died in New York City that day, I don't think he could have gotten a bigger funeral than what they give to Michael Cresap, even though they have no idea really who this guy is.
And they bury him at Trinity Church, and his gravestone is still there, although it's a copy. We need to follow Logan. The book is Heart of American Darkness. Robert G. Parkinson is the author. Bewilderment and Horror on the Early Frontier. This is supposed to be overwhelming. It was at the time. There were no easy categories. You were what you said that day. I'm a patriot. No, I'm loyal to the crown. I'm married to a Native American, or I am a land speculator, and here's my money, and I'll buy your property from you, even though you don't have a deed. Anything's possible. The Cresap family, however, remains at the center of our interest, and we need to follow the Logan family, the Shikellamy family.
Yep.
Because there's another twist here. A man who is a surveyor comes across a Native American weeping, a young man who is Mingo. Who is he weeping? Why is he weeping? And what does he tell the surveyor?
So the surveyor, this is 20 years after Logan's Lament and Yellow Creek. This is 1794, and this surveyor who is out there um, uh, scouting around for Pennsylvania's interests comes upon this weeping man, and so they sit down they have a conversation. They have a long conversation over the course of a whole day. In the morning, they talk about why he's there and what's been going on, and then this native person brings up some pretty bad memories and says some pretty ugly things about United States native policy during the Revolution and after. And so he said, to change the subject, he says, look, why don't we have lunch? And then while they're eating lunch, he says, hey, what? Your name's Logan? That's so funny. What about the famous Logan, Mingo chief? Do you have any relation to him? And this native person says, yeah, that was my uncle. And he says, oh, really? That was your uncle? That's crazy. Is your uncle still alive? And this native person says, no, I killed him. And the surveyor is shocked beyond belief and can't believe, what do you mean? You killed your uncle? Why did you do that? And so he goes into the reasoning why he believes he was ordered by the Six Nations to take care of James Logan Shekhelemi, the Logan of Logan's Lament, and murders him close to Lake Erie in Sandusky, Ohio, in the middle of the Revolutionary War. And there are a number of stories about what happens to Logan, but that one seems to make the most sense. And so a nephew kills his uncle for reasons we can get into, John.
Yes, let's look at the fact what happens after Logan's Lament, because we're not sure what year he died. There are stories against him. Alcohol, I think, is the chief story against him. Right. There are stories that say he started another family. There are stories that say he was too powerful at what? Did they say too powerful a magical figure? How did they think of him, Rob? No, he had too much power.
Too powerful an orator, just like we see with the Lament. The situation in the Ohio country throughout the Revolutionary War is on many, many knife's edges. It sits on several razor's edges for the British, for the Americans, and for Native peoples.
Yes, never forget that Washington makes war on the Native Americans during the time he's fighting the British.
Yep. And not just him, but Michael Cresap's pal, George Rogers Clark, has a couple of expeditions against Native peoples. There is a lot of fighting in the West. After Yorktown, the bloodiest ground really of the Revolution is in the Ohio country after Cornwallis surrenders and before the peace treaty is signed. So the Ohio country is a very, very difficult. It's a bewildering place. And so if you have someone who is very, very a powerful orator, and this is what that weeping native, his name is Todkados. He is John. The son of the oldest brother of the Shekhelemi family. He says, a man as powerful and persuasive like Logan, he was too dangerous. He had to be silenced because a number of Native peoples would go whichever direction he said they would. And that might be against the British, that might be against the Iroquois, and they couldn't have a free agent like that operating. And so that's why they said this man needs to be silenced around 1780.
I mention, because there's so much to this story, that the war on the natives included massacres, horrible massacre. And we're mentioning those around the edges because Rob identifies 1782 when the fighting entirely stopped between Washington's army and the British army was the bloodiest of the years of the Revolution. The peace treaty is 1783. So we're going to now turn to a mystery that Rob solves about what happens to Logan's Lament. And it begins with the Vice President of the United States, whom we all know as Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States. But before that, he was Vice President, he was Secretary of State, he was Ambassador to France, and he was a man trying to use Logan's Lament as a way of demonstrating the superiority of this new world, the United States of America. Well, the Confederate States of America becoming the United States. The book is Heart of American Darkness. Robert G. Parkinson is the author. Bewilderment and Horror in the Early Frontier. The events of the 1750s through the 1780s are behind us. Logan's Lament remains. Discovered by Thomas Jefferson, writing a book about science in Virginia, the only book Rob says he ever wrote. However, he discovers the story of Logan's Lament for his purposes. As I understand it, he's looking to make it clear to the Europeans that America is not an inferior race. But again, this is a twist of the story, so I need the professor's help. Logan's Lament is about a man who had his family taken from him by murderous conduct of the Cresap family. However, Jefferson needs Logan to be a hero. So how does he do it, Rob?
So when Dunmore returns in 1774 from the West, he has a copy of this text with him in his bags. And Jefferson is in Williamsburg. There's parties to celebrate this victory over the Shawnee, and this is in the months before Lexington and Concord. And even the Virginia Assembly, the Virginia Convention, sends a letter of thanks to Lord Dunmore for taking care of this in the weeks before all hell's going to break loose. And Jefferson writes it down in his memorandum book. He says later on that this speech flew through all of the publications, and it was the topic of conversation throughout Williamsburg. And so he writes down the speech in his memorandum book. Well, in the early 1780s, after France joins up with makes an alliance with the United States, they are so eager to do so, mostly because they just want to stick it to the British and avenge the 7 Years' War and the wars of the 18th century. And so they ally themselves with the American colonies, knowing very, very little about them. And so the French delegation to the Continental Congress sends out a list of questions, basic questions to all of the governors of the 13 new American states. Hey, tell us about your animals. Tell us about your minerals. Tell us about how much natural resources are there. What are the boundaries of your colony? Those are the questions that land on Governor Jefferson's desk as the governor of Virginia. And after things go very, very badly not only for Virginia gets invaded 3 different times, and Monticello is raided, and Jefferson is sort of flees in disgrace as the governor of Virginia, and he breaks his wrist, it falls off a horse. It's a really bad time for Jefferson. So he decides to work on this project, and he starts answering these questions that the French have asked him. And he turns that opportunity into this long tract called The Notes on the State of Virginia. It's a book. Again, Jefferson could have answered these questions very, very directly with a couple of sentences, but that's not how that's going to go. And one of the things that's sort of making it around Enlightenment circles is the idea put out by a French naturalist named the Comte de Buffon, who says that everything in America is degenerate. All the plants, all the animals, all the people are lesser than Europe. And there are climate reasons for this, mostly, but he basically says that everything in America is lesser and inferior to Europe. And Jefferson is not going to stand for that. And so what the Notes on the State of Virginia really is doing is proving American equality or superiority and the goodness of the American Revolution. And for that, to prove that Native peoples are intelligent and well-spoken and fantastic orators, he flips back to the memorandum book and he sees Logan's Lament and he grabs it and he features it at the core of this tract about fighting a battle in the Enlightenment, which has nothing to do with what Logan was doing or anything like that. It's to prove that there are American Demosthenes and Ciceros living in the woods of America. Take that, Buffon.
And Jefferson deals with the story inexactly. What I'm fascinated by as you take me through this, Rob, is that we've seen Michael Cresap a man who's responsible for instigating mass murder of women. We've seen him turned into a patriot because the New Yorkers needed him, or the patriots needed him. Now we're seeing Michael Cresap thrown back into the woods as a man who violated a family, the Shikellamy family, cruelly. And Shikellamy, James Logan, is elevated because Jefferson needs him.
Right.
Now, it would be a simple story to say Jefferson gets away with it, but he doesn't, because I believe there's a man named Martin who's married into the Cresap family, and he begins a ferocious, obsessive correspondence while Jefferson is vice president. I don't know how long. Does it carry on all the way to the presidency? He pounds.
No, it goes for a couple of years, but it extends into the bad years of 1798. So while Jefferson is trying to keep the Union together, he's also having to deal with trying to defend himself against Luther Martin's charges.
And Martin is saying Jefferson's made this up, that the Cresaps were heroic and defended the frontier from the savages, of whom Logan is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have competing narratives. Now, I'd like to say that this doesn't need to be resolved, but it does, because, again, Rob gives us the bibliography of where this fight carried on. It's taken up by the Europeans and the American printers and the historians. Eventually, it reaches McGuffey's reader. Why? What is it about Logan's Lament that appeals to your understanding, Rob?
Well, yeah. So in this fight, I mean, so Jefferson, when he writes it down in 1774, believes all of the he takes at face value all the wrong mistakes that are going on, and so he again, like Logan, blames the Cresap family for this, and this is what Luther Martin, who's married into the Cresap family, and his attorney, he's the longest serving attorney general for Maryland. He goes to the Constitutional Convention. He allegedly hates Federalists, but he hates Jefferson more, so he becomes a Federalist, becomes pals with Aaron Burr because they hate Jefferson together. And so Logan's Lament becomes kind of the centerpiece of what you extract out of the Notes on the State of Virginia. And so it falls into all of these school primers, of which the McGuffey readers are the most famous and the most prominent, but for 25 or 30 years beforehand, American school children have been memorizing Logan's Lament. Why? Well, first of all, it's a short piece. It's 250 words. It's 20 less than the Gettysburg Address. It's good. It's a good exercise for a 10-year-old, mostly boy, to memorize. And so that becomes, it has its own logic to it. But the final line of the Lament is the most famous one. The what Logan ends with, he says, "Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one." And that is him saying, my family is all gone. Now his family's all not gone, as we said. His nephew is going to kill him, so his family's not entirely gone. But he says that, and that appeals to people, and especially into the era of Indian removal. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one becomes pretty close to American political policy in the 1820s and 30s. And so that also adds to the sort of the idea of the vanishing Indian, adds to, Logan being a noble savage, fits with this sort of cultural practice that fits with political practice.
And so the way to understand this is that it's not Logan anymore. It's the Native American legend.
Yes.
That is being dealt with as a way of saying they're all gone now. And no one is to blame for that, right? The Cresaps, because Jefferson condemns Cresap, but when Logan's Lament is used later on, is there attention to Cresap, or is Cresap just understood as a generalized frontiersman?
Yeah, you can say that, but the Cresap family certainly is going to launch crusade after crusade.
Oh, yes.
to try to clear their name from this. They take it very personally.
Yes, we're now going to have the Battle of Monuments and the Tree.
Yeah,
the book is part of American Darkness. Robert Parkinson is the author. Bewilderment and Horror on the Early Frontier. We fought the French and Indian Wars, 3 of them. We fought the American Revolution. We certainly have survived through the War of 1812. McGuffey's Reader into the 1840s, 1850s. I've got one. I sent away for one. And the school children across America are learning Logan's Lament. However, that does not satisfy the battling families, the Cresaps in particular. There's a tree called Logan's Tree. Where is it, Mark?
It is just outside of Circleville, Ohio today.
And under that tree, there are ceremonies. There are also battling monuments. I lost track of how many monuments. It was like you put up a monument, and it's like a monument war. We put up a monument.
I think there's 4 there. Mm-hmm.
There are 4 of them. One of them is the tall Mingo chieftain.
Mm-hmm.
And the families are still not satisfied. What is it that they want? What will end this dispute that's beyond the grave?
Well, so they're trying to. So what Luther Martin tries to do with newspapers and print is to try to clear the Cresap name, and that doesn't really work because of this sort of tide of popularity with the Lament. And so by the end of the 19th century, 1880s and 90s, Americans go on this bender about remembering their past, right? And so this is the years of the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause is born. These are the years right after the centennial of the American Revolution. And so they're putting up monuments all over the place in the 1880s, 80s, and 90s into the 1900s. And pioneer families, quote unquote pioneers, are not far behind the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so they are wanting to establish that these families were at the heart of American of this fantastic, exceptional new thing in the world, right? And so you have families like the Winthrop family, like the Underhill family, a bunch of sort of Pilgrim or Puritan families who are going to try to figure out all of their genealogical, sort of focus their genealogical might to prove that they were pioneers for American goodness. And the Cresaps do this too. The Cresap Society is founded. They put up a monument that rebuts, it's right outside of the elm tree where Logan gave the Lament, saying, he didn't, our family had nothing to do with this. On one side of the monument, on the other side, they say, here are all of the people who signed the treaty ending Dunmore's war. And it's not the prettiest monument. It's put together with some family money, but that spurs some people who live in the Circleville, Chillicothe area to then put up their own monument to Logan, which sits right across from it about 30 or 40 yards away and faces that, which has the text of the Logan's Lament on it, has a statue to Logan to it. And there are a number of others that are created after this, where you have, this is the final kind of battleground between the Cresap family and the Shekhelemi family. That goes on into the early 20th century.
Logan Elm State Memorial Park. Is the tree still there?
The tree is not there. The tree got struck by lightning in the 1950s, which killed, it was a massive, massive, impressive tree and then it got sick and they cut it down in 1964.
We live in the flicker. May it last as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday, heart of darkness. Explain, Rob, how does that work?
So I return to this at the end of the book about when Conrad talks about the flicker, he says, it's a scary world out there and we live in darkness, but the flicker, he uses the kind of flash of lightning to talk about how we try to make sense of the world around us. We have these moments where we can see. And he thinks about that we try our best to live in that flicker. We try to be able to see the world around us, but really the world around us is dark. And so it's human beings create all these things to prolong the flicker. And so what have we been talking about? We've been talking about the creation of colonies and land companies, republicanism, patriotism, treaty conferences, all sorts of things. Those are the flicker. We are trying to make sense of the world around us, but really the world around us is really a bewildering and terrifying darkness. And so we have to remember that that's really the world we live in, as we try to defeat the darkness by creating lightning flashes that can often make the darkness even more disturbing.
And this story, because we kept switching sides, at first I kept score, but then I gave up, Rob.
You and me both.
Yes, the effect, as an amateur reader of your book, the effect is that the American Revolution shrinks in comparison to what was actually going on, which was an overwhelming invasion of people who were land hungry, property hungry, and turning America into what we have today, a capitalist republic. But the Native Americans were never going to be part of it. I don't believe even the utopians didn't seem to have a plan. If I read this correctly, they made treaties with them, but then they'd elbow them out or allow the rascals along the frontier to elbow them out. How did you read it, Rob? Because you've done all this work. I've just read your book.
Well,
did the Native Americans ever have a chance to be integrated into the Republic?
that's a tall ask. Now in 1778, there's an opportunity that there is a treat. The Americans are so desperate because things are going so badly that there is an offer made, written into a treaty conference in 1778, that the Delaware Indians will become the 14th state of the Union. People in Pittsburgh are so desperate that they're willing to entertain the idea of Delaware Indians being allowed a delegation at the Continental Congress. Now, that goes nowhere in Philadelphia. Two things I want to bring up in response to your question. One, yes, this seems like an inevitable process, but what I want this book to do is to foreground the contingency about how these particular things, how Logan, the Logan family and the Cresap family and the biographies, the choices that these individuals made, while they perpetuated some of these things, had those situations been different, it would have looked very differently. For example, on one of Logan's raids, he's out in the very, very bottom, sort of the southwestern part of Virginia on the Tennessee border. And one of the people who rides after him and tries to stop him is a young Lieutenant Daniel Boone. Now, if Logan would have killed Daniel Boone in 1774, would American pioneer history be different? Yes, it would. It would be very different. Now, would it be different in the aggregate? Maybe not, but the details would have been different. And that, I think, is important for us to understand. This is not a teleological, ever-evolving, inevitable process, but it is full of contingency and biography. And then there's the American Revolution. So what the American Revolution does is it emboldens the Michael Cresaps of the world as these true-blooded, true blue American patriots. And whereas the Daniel Boones and the Michael Cresaps of the world were seen as kind of suspicious and maybe bloodthirsty and really not part of us before 1775, now they are the centerpiece of what it means to be an American. And government, which the British government had tried to hold them back, now the American Republic is going to get behind them and say, what can we do to help you? How can we help you pursue your happiness in different ways? What government seems to be not a resisting force, but an enabling force. And that patriotism that is born in 1775, which is a new thing, is really sort of adds an element to the story that's different than what came before.
Robert G. Parkinson, Art of American Darkness, Bewilderment and Horror on the Early Frontier. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.